Hello, and welcome back to Read Aloud with Dan. That's me, I'm Dan. Welcome back. Today we're reading from Chapter 4 of The State and Revolution. This will be part 1 of Chapter 4, as in the last chapter was so long that I got tired in the middle of it, and I need to break this up sometimes. So we'll be reading from the first 3 sections. Chapter 4. What we can do, like I did previously, is try to start with a little bit of a introduction. I think you like that when I do that, so let's do that. This is coming from sort of a trot website again. We've talked about this in the past. Whatever. Chapter 4, Supplementary Explanations by Engels. Lenin continues his Marxist analysis of the state in Chapter 4, while making extensive use of quotes by Engels. He focuses on Engels throughout, absolutely. He begins by making a clear distinction between a Marxist analysis and the views of the anarchists, who do not see the state withering away, but abolished overnight. See, the anarchists believe that they hold this magical abolish the state button, which they can only push after the revolution. And, well, that's the thing. They've never really achieved it, so they've never pushed the button that they apparently hold behind their backs. The proletariat must use the state as a temporary means to overcome the inevitable resistance of the bourgeoisie. The anarchists would deny the working class this valuable means of defending the revolution. He explains that the commune and all genuine workers' states differ from all previously existing states, in that they are, for the first time, used by the majority to repress a minority. And we're not talking about a minority of, like race or something like that, you guys. We're talking about a minority of oppressors. And they oppress the majority of people. That's what we're talking about. Instead of being a special force standing above society, it becomes representative of the majority of the population. Imagine that, right? Lenin goes on to explain why Marxists are not neutral on the question of what the form bourgeois states take. A democratic republic is preferable to despotic monarchy, although the ideal form is a centralized democratic republic. However, this does not trump the national question. It does not. And let's continue the reading. Yeah, the Trot's websites, sometimes they do okay. Reading from Chapter 4, Supplementary Explanations by Engels. Marx gave the fundamentals concerning the significance of the experience of the commune. Engels returned to the same subject time and again, and explained Marx's analysis and conclusions, sometimes elucidating other aspects of the question with such power and vividness that it is necessary to deal with his explanations specially. Section 1. The Housing Question. In his work, The Housing Question of 1872, Engels already took into account the experience of the commune and dealt several times with the tasks of the revolution in relation to the state. It is interesting to note that the treatment of this specific subject clearly revealed, on the one hand, points of similarity between the proletarian side and the present side, points that warrant speaking of the state in both cases, and, on the other hand, points of difference between them, or the transition of the destruction of the state. Engels says, how is the housing question to be settled then? In present-day society, it is settled just as any other social question, by the gradual economic leveling of demand and supply, a settlement which reproduces the question itself again and again, and therefore is no settlement. How a social revolution would settle this question not only depends on the circumstances in each particular case, but is also connected with much more far-reaching questions, one of the most fundamental of which is the abolition of the antithesis between town and country. As it is not our task to create utopian systems for the organization of the future society, it would be more than idle to go into the question here. But one thing is certain: there is already a sufficient quantity of houses in the big cities to remedy immediately all real housing shortage, provided they are used judiciously. I'll pause here and say that's also the case in the imperial core, where there are roughly 30 available dwellings for every unhoused family. Yeah, think about that. This can naturally, reading on, Engels says, this can naturally only occur through the expropriation of the present owners, and by quartering in their houses homeless workers or workers overcrowded in their present homes. As soon as the proletariat has won political power, such a measure prompted by concern for the common good will be just as easy to carry out as are other expropriations and billetings by the present day state. Hey Dan, why are we reading this thing from Engels from 1872? Because it's obviously still relevant. The change, Lenin says, in the form of state power is not examined here, but only the content of its activity. Expropriations and billetings take place by order even of the present state. From the formal point of view, the proletarian state will also order the occupation of dwellings and expropriation of houses. But it is clear that the old executive apparatus, the bureaucracy, which is connected with the bourgeoisie, would simply be unfit to carry out the orders of the proletarian state. Engels says, it must be pointed out that the actual seizure of all the instruments of labor, the taking possession of industry as a whole by the working people, is the exact opposite of the Proudhonist redemption. In the latter case, the individual worker becomes the owner of the dwelling, the peasant farm, the instruments of labor. In the former case, the working people remain the collective owners of the houses, factories, and instruments of labor, and will hardly permit their use, at least during a transitional period, by individuals or associations without compensation for the cost. In the same way, the abolition of property in land is not the abolition of ground rent, but its transfer, if in a modified form, to society. The actual seizure of all the instruments of labor by the working people, therefore, does not at all preclude the retention of rent relations. Lenin says, we shall examine the question touched upon in this passage, namely, the economic basis for the withering away of the state. In the next chapter, Engels expresses himself most cautiously, saying that the proletarian state would hardly permit the use of houses without payment, quote, at least during a transitional period. The letting of houses owned by the whole people to individual families presupposes the collection of rent, a certain amount of control, and the employment of some standard in allotting the housing. All this calls for a certain form of state, but it does not at all call for a special military bureaucratic apparatus with officials occupying especially privileged positions. The transition to a situation in which it will be possible to supply dwellings rent-free depends on the complete withering away of the state. So at first you're reading this and you're like, wait, Engels doesn't want to get rid of rent relations. What is he, some sort of liberal? No. He recognizes there's no abolish the state button. Therefore, rent relations will not go away initially. And it will not necessarily happen immediately. Sure, there will be some forms of socialist society that will do away with it immediately. But that's another point. Okay? Okay. You know what? Can you think of one where they did away with it immediately? I cannot. Takes time, doesn't it? Anyways, I guess that's the subject we can think about and discuss. Sound off in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button, please. Okay, so Lenin says, where was I? Yeah. So again, the letting of houses owed by the whole people to individual families presupposes the collection of rent, a certain amount of control, and the employment of some standard in allotting the housing. All this calls for a certain form of state, but it does not at all call for a special military bureaucratic apparatus with officials occupying especially privileged positions. Again, the transition to a situation in which it will be possible to supply dwellings rent-free depends on the withering away of the state. Thank you for allowing me to read that over again. Engels says, speaking of the Blomqvist's adoption of the fundamental position of Marxism after the Commune and under the influence of its experience, Engels, in passing, formulates this position as follows. Necessity of political action by the proletariat and of its dictatorship as the transition to the abolition of classes with them of the state. Lenin says, addicts of hair-splitting criticism, or bourgeois exterminators of Marxism, will perhaps see a contradiction between this recognition of the abolition of the state and repudiation of this formula as an anarchist one in the above passage from Anti-Düring. It would not be surprising if the opportunists classed Engels, too, as an anarchist, for it is becoming increasingly common with the social chauvinists to accuse the internationalists of anarchism. Marxism has always taught that, with the abolition of classes, the state will also be abolished. The well-known passage on the withering away of the state in Anti-Düring accuses the anarchists not simply of favoring the abolition of the state, but of preaching that the state can be abolished overnight. As the now prevailing social democratic doctrine completely distorts the relation of Marxism to anarchism on the question of the abolition of the state, it will be particularly useful to recall a certain controversy in which Marx and Engels came out against the anarchists. That brings us to Section 2, Controversy with the Anarchists. This controversy took place in 1873. Marx and Engels contributed articles against the Proudhonists, autonomists, or anti-authoritarians to an Italian socialist annual. And it was not until 1913 that these articles appeared in German in Neue Zeit. Marx and Engels? Yeah. Oh, this is by Engels. This quote's from Engels here. Engels says, if the political struggle of the working class assumes revolutionary form, assumes revolutionary form, wrote Marx, not Engels, ridiculing the anarchists for their repudiation of politics. And if the workers set up their revolutionary dictatorship in place of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, they commit the terrible crime of violating principles. For in order to satisfy their wretched, vulgar, everyday needs and to crush the resistance of the bourgeoisie, they give the state a revolutionary and transient form, instead of laying down their arms and abolishing the state. Lenin says, it was solely against this kind of abolition of the state that Marx fought in refuting the anarchists. He did not at all oppose the view that the state would disappear when classes disappeared, or that it would be abolished when classes were abolished. What he did oppose was the proposition that the workers should renounce the use of arms, organized violence, that is, the state, which is to serve to crush the resistance of the bourgeoisie. And I hate to say how relevant that is right now. At least here in the imperial core. But imagine living in the center of the Death Star and asking for blaster control. Oh, honey. Sure. Yeah. Just let the stormkeepers have the blasters. Great. Yeah. Good. We're doing great. Lenin says, to prevent the true meaning of this struggle, of his struggle against anarchism from being distorted, Marx expressly emphasized the revolutionary and transient form of the state which the proletariat needs. The proletariat needs the state only temporarily. We do not... let me say that again. The proletariat needs the state only temporarily. We do not, after all, differ with the anarchists on the question of the abolition of the state as the aim. We maintain that, to achieve this aim, we must temporarily make use of the instruments, resources, and methods of state power against the exploiters, just as the temporary dictatorship of the oppressed class is necessary for the abolition of classes. Marx chooses the sharpest and clearest way of stating his case against the anarchists. After overthrowing the yoke of capitalists, should the workers lay down their arms or use them against the capitalists in order to crush their resistance, which is inevitable? But what is the systematic use of arms by one class against another, if not a transient form of state? Let every social democrat ask himself, is that how he has been posing the question of the state in controversy with the anarchists? Is that how it has been posed by the vast majority of the official socialist parties of the Second International? Engels expounds the same ideas in much greater detail and still more popularly. First of all, he ridicules the muddled ideas of the Proudhonists who call themselves anti-authoritarians, that is, repudiating all authority, all subordination, all power. Take a factory, a railway, a ship on the high seas, said Engels. That's Marx. That's Engels. Is it not clear that not one of these complex technical establishments, based on the use of machinery and the systematic cooperation of many people, could function without a certain amount of subordination and consequently without a certain amount of authority or power? Engels says, when I counter the most rabid anti-authoritarians with these arguments, the only answer they can give me is the following. Oh, that's true, except that here it is not a question of authority with which we vest our delegates, but of a commission. These people imagine they can change a thing by changing its name. I'm going to be honest, I think that part is not... Oh, okay, yeah. That is part of Engels' quote. I got confused there. Thank you for bearing with me as I'm got confused reading on. Lenin says, having thus shown that authority and autonomy are relative terms, that the sphere of their application varies with the various phases of social development, that it is absurd to take them as absolutes, and adding that the sphere of application of machinery and large-scale production is steadily expanding, Engels passes from the general discussion of authority to the question of the state. Had the autonomists, he wrote, contented themselves with saying that the social organization of the future would allow authority only within the bounds which the conditions of production make inevitable, one would have to come to terms with them. But they are blind to all facts that make authority necessary, and they passionately fight the word. Why do the anti-authoritarians not confine themselves to crying out against political authority, the state? All socialists are agreed that the state, and with it, political authority, will disappear as a result of the coming social revolution. That is, that public functions will lose their political character and become mere administrative functions of watching over social interests. But the anti-authoritarians demand that the political state be abolished at one stroke, even before the social relations that gave birth to it have been destroyed. They demand that the first act of the social revolution shall be the abolition of authority. Have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is an act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon, all of which are highly authoritarian means. And the victorious party must maintain its rule by means of the terror which its arms inspire in the reactionaries. Would the Paris Commune have lasted more than a day if it had not used the authority of the armed people against the bourgeoisie? Cannot we, on the contrary, blame it for having made too little use of that authority? Therefore, one of two things. Either that anti-authoritarians don't know what they're talking about, in which case they're creating nothing but confusion, or they do know, and in that case, they are betraying the cause of the proletariat. In either case, they serve only reaction. God damn, is that a banger. Woo! Lenin says, this argument touches upon questions which should be examined in connection with the relationship between politics and economics during the withering away of the state. He says the next chapter is devoted to this. These questions are the transformation of public functions from political into simple functions of administration and the political state. This last term, one particularly liable to misunderstanding, indicates the process of the withering away of the state. At a certain stage of this process, the state which is withering away may be called a non-political state. Again, the most remarkable thing in this argument of Engels is the way he states his case against the anarchists. Social democrats, claiming to be disciples of Engels, have argued on this subject against the anarchists millions of times since 1873, but they have not argued as Marxists could and should. The anarchist idea of abolition of the state is muddled and non-revolutionary. That is how Engels put it. It is precisely the revolution in its rise and development, with its specific tasks in relation to violence, authority, power, the state, that the anarchists refuse to see. The usual criticism of anarchism by present-day social democrats has boiled down to the purest Philistine banality. We recognize the state, whereas anarchists do not. Naturally, such banality cannot but repel workers who are at all capable of thinking and revolutionary-minded. What Engels says is different. He stresses that all socialists recognize that the state will disappear as a result of the socialist revolution. He then deals specifically with the question of the revolution, the very question which, as a rule, the social democrats evade out of opportunism, leaving it, so to speak, exclusively for the anarchists to work out. And when dealing with this question, Engels takes the bull by the horns. He asks, should not the commune have made more use of the revolutionary power of the state? That is, of the proletariat armed and organized as the ruling class. The revolutionary power of the state. Again, one that's withering away, but the revolutionary power of the state nonetheless. Lenin says, prevailing official social democracy usually dismissed the question of the concrete tasks of the proletariat in the revolution either with a Philistine sneer or at best with the sophistic evasion, the future will show. And the anarchists were justified in saying about such social democrats that they were failing in their tasks of giving the workers a revolutionary education. Engels draws upon the experience of the last proletarian revolution precisely for the purpose of making a most concrete study of what should be done by the proletariat and in what manner, in relation to both the banks and the state. And that takes us to section 3, Letter to Bebel. Lenin says, one of the most, if not the most, remarkable observation on the state in the works of Marx and Engels is contained in the following passage in Engels's letter to Bebel. Bebel, dated March 18th to 28th, 1875. This guy took 10 days to write this letter. Then again, if I were writing a letter to a guy this handsome, I think it would take me a while too. Oh my gosh, striking. Holy moly. Lenin says, this letter, we may observe in parentheses, was, as far as we know, first published by Bebel in the second volume of his memoirs, Aus meinem Leben, which appeared in 1911, that is, 36 years after the letter had been written and sent. Wow. Engels wrote to Bebel, criticizing the same draft of the Gotha program, which Marx criticized in his famous letter to Braque, or Braque, referring specifically to the question of the state. Engels said, "The free people's state has been transferred into the free state. Taken in its grammatical sense, a free state is one where the state is free in relation to its citizens. Hence, a state with a despotic government. The whole talk about the state should be dropped, especially since the commune, which was no longer a state in the proper sense of the word. The people's state has been thrown in our faces by the anarchists to the point of disgust, although already Marx's book Against Proudhon and later the Communist Manifesto say plainly that with the introduction of the socialist order of society, the state dissolves of itself, or sich auflöst, and disappears. Ist kaputt." That's not funny. As the state is only a transitional institution which is used in the struggle, in the revolution, to hold down one's adversaries by force, it is sheer nonsense to talk of a free people's state. So long as the proletariat still needs the state, it does not need it in the interests of freedom, but in order to hold down its adversaries. And as soon as it becomes possible to speak of the freedom of the state as such ceases to exist. We would therefore propose replacing the state everywhere by Gemeinwesen, a good old German word which can very well take the place of the French word commune. Lenin says, "It should be borne in mind that this letter refers to the party program which Marx criticized in a letter dated only weeks later than the above." Marx's letter is dated May 5th, 1875. And that at the time Engels was living with Marx in London. Consequently, when he says "we" in the last sentence, Engels, undoubtedly in his own as well as in Marx's name, suggests to the leader of the German Workers' Party that the word state be struck out of the program and be replaced by the word community. What a howl about anarchism would be raised by the leading lights of present-day Marxism, which has been falsified for the convenience of opportunists, if such an amendment of the program were suggested to them. Let them howl. This will earn them the praises of the bourgeoisie. And we shall go on with our work. In revising the program of our party, we must by all means take the advice of Engels and Marx into consideration in order to come nearer the truth, to restore Marxism by ridding it of distortions, to guide the struggle of the working class for its emancipation more correctly. Certainly, no one opposed to the advice of Engels and Marx will be found among the Bolsheviks. The only difficulty that may perhaps arise will be in regard to the term. In German, there are two words meaning community, of which Engels used the one which does not denote a single community, but their totality, a system of communities. In Russian, there is no such word, and we may have to choose the French word commune, although this also has its drawbacks. The commune was no longer a state in the proper sense of the word. This is the most theoretically important statement Engels makes. After what has been said above, this statement is perfectly clear. The commune was ceasing to be a state since it had to suppress not the majority of the population, but a minority, the exploiters. It had smashed the bourgeois state machine. In place of a special coercive force, the population itself came on the scene. And all this was a departure from the state in the proper sense of the word. And had the commune become firmly established, all traces of the state in it would have withered away by themselves. It would not have had to abolish the institutions of the state. They would have ceased to function as they ceased to have anything to do. The people's state has been thrown in our faces by the anarchists. In saying this, Engels above all has in mind Bakunin and his attacks on the German Social Democrats. Engels admits that these attacks were justified insofar as the people's state was as much an absurdity and as much a departure from socialism as the free people's state. Engels tried to put the struggle of the German Social Democrats against the anarchists on the right lines, to make this struggle correct in principle, to rid it of opportunist prejudices concerning the state. Unfortunately, Engels' letter was pigeonholed for 36 years. We shall see farther on that even after this letter was published, Kautsky persisted in virtually the same mistakes against which Engels had warned. Bebel replied to Engels in a letter dated September 21st, 1875, in which he wrote, among other things, that he fully agreed with Engels' opinion on the draft program, and that he had reproached Liebknecht with readiness to make concessions. But if we take Bebel's pamphlet, Our Aims, we find there views on the state that are absolutely wrong. Bebel says, the state must be transformed from one based on class rule into a people's state. Lenin says this was printed in the ninth edition of Bebel's pamphlet. It is not surprising that opportunist views on the state, so persistently repeated, were absorbed by the German Social Democrats, especially as Engels' revolutionary interpretations had been safely pigeonholed, and all the conditions of life were such as to wean them from revolution for a long time. And that's where I'm going to wrap up my reading here for today. If you're watching live, stick around. If you're watching the replay, check out part 2 of chapter 4, where we will read the sections 4, 5, and 6. You can support my content, my media. Support independent communist media if you like this. It really does mean a lot. There are some links below. Check that out. And thank you so much for being with me today and for doing the work. Really appreciate that. Good for you. Give yourself a nice pat on the back. Okay, we'll see you next time. Love your face.